Hello, my name is Mark Shemp. I am president of the Historic Preservation Society of Tullahoma, and I'm pleased to be with Dr. David McCoy today, who is president of the Museum of the American Military Experience. The Preservation Society decided that it was very important that we acknowledge and commemorate the history of World War I. We are now in our 100th year since that war started, and we are fortunate that we have a local hero, Sergeant Alvin York, who is well known through history for his involvement in World War I. We were able to find, through the efforts of Dr. McCoy and his organization, this wonderful exhibit that he is going to explain to you here and walk you and talk you through it. And I want to just welcome you, Dr. McCoy. We really appreciate it. He is a wealth of knowledge. We are greatly appreciative that you have taken it upon you and your organization have taken it upon yourselves to put together this display and this exhibit, and I think it's something that everybody that's come so far to visit with us has found interesting, and we look forward to you filling us in on the history and the story behind this.
Oh, sure enough, and I'm real pleased to be here. Thank you very much, and to have a great opportunity in this location to share the story. What we're trying to do as a museum is to commemorate and preserve the stuff and the stories from pre-revolutionary American history all the way through Iraq and Afghanistan. And the hope is that we can use the items, the uniforms, the diaries, the letters, the photographs, all the different portions of the history in an expressive way to save and preserve what they did, what they experienced, but also what they felt like. And that's what we're excited about, the way this display came together, this In the Footsteps of Sergeant York, because it is about Sergeant York and it is about what he did, but as he tried to tell people from the very beginning, it was what we did. And there were the folks in the patrol with him. Those people are in this display too. And everybody had a part to play. The bullets that went to them, the bullets that killed his best friend that day, that very first thing that morning, Murray Savage. When Murray Savage got killed, it was because the machine gun burst was aimed not at Sergeant York, but it was aimed at Murray Savage. And those are the folks who paid the sacrifice, and that's exactly what York tried to say from the beginning. We were all in it together.
And it is very evident when a humble man he is in recognizing that heroes are selected, have to have somebody represent, but it's not necessarily about that individual, but about the group of individuals.
That's true.
One of the things that I found interesting when I looked through there is there was a predominantly New Englandish northeastern makeup of the group that Sergeant York was with. How did that blend of people come to be?
It's interesting that the 82nd Division during World War I was not at all airborne related, but they were truly, as the depiction was always, that they were the All-Americans. And on the division patch, it's used the AA, and we'll see that in some of the displays, some of the photographs. The AA stands for All-American. And that's what it was, a cross-section of All-American.
Well, having said that, then we would invite you to join us on this tour as Dr. McCoy leads us around the room. But before we do that, I want to take a brief moment, please, if I can ask Marjorie Collier to step up, because all great movements or agencies and organization or events require a spark plug. Somebody that says, well, we're going to do it and we're going to get out here and get it done. And I want Ms. Marjorie Collier, who is the Vice President of the Historic Preservation Society, President of our local Historic Zoning Society, and a longtime community activist for preservation issues and historical compilation. And Marjorie, I just am grateful for all you've done, and I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. We're very honored to have this exhibit here. I think it's a great honor for Tullahoma and the surrounding community. And thank you so much for coming and telling us all about it.
So, from the summer of 2014, with something that started in 1914, and we'll ask Dr. McCoy now to take us on the tour.
The showrooms of the South Jackson Civic Center in Tullahoma, Tennessee, and we're wanting to share today this In the Footsteps of Sergeant York. And it's exciting because in that World War I era, and it is about an American hero, Sergeant York, but it's about all of these folks who were a draft army and a volunteer army, very few regular soldiers, Marines, sailors. They were expanded overnight to fight a worldwide war effort. And what's exciting is to realize the numbers that were involved, and that's what this panel depicts. Over 4 million Americans were mobilized. This dwarfs the American Civil War. It's incredible to think the numbers that were involved, and America suddenly, from becoming a backwater military, became a frontline world power. And this is all about that process of how ordinary people in a citizen army, Navy, Marine Corps, could be developed into a world power really in a very short time. This is depicting here the black soldiers that were finally starting to be integrated into the network. They largely fought with the French, and this depiction here in the showcase shows the French helmet on the French soldier. The French submachine gun highlights the fact that we in the American Army, we didn't have a light machine gun, a squad machine gun. We were using European weapons until the Browning automatic rifle got developed right at the end of the war. And this was a nightmare to use. But he used it, a lot of American soldiers did. This depiction is a classic draftee wearing the gas mask, and it highlights one of the remarkable features about the World War effort was the introduction of gas as a weapon, and all that went along with that, and it shows the soldier with the gas mask. This Eddystone rifle, the magazine rifle, is exactly what York used at that time, October 8th, 1918, in the Argonne. That's the rifle he used to kill the German soldiers and to save that patrol, to save the whole mission of that company. When we go over and look in the grave depiction in Murray Savage's grave remains, one of the rifles is lying right on top of the grave. It's an Eddystone rifle just like this one. So it wasn't an 03 Springfield, it was these Eddystone magazine rifles that were originally developed and being exported to Britain as European weapons. The British were using them, and they converted them over then to an American weapon when America entered the war. The other neat thing about this mannequin and the depiction, it shows the utensil. There's a fork stuck in the puttee. It's fascinating when we look at the grave sites and the display on the other side, how many of those utensils were in those remains, those grave sites. They had taken all the gear and equipment off those soldiers when they were buried. And it's just like Murray's rifle was lying on top of the grave, but what was buried in the grave was everything that was in or on their uniforms. One of the things, oddly enough, 3 out of 4 of the soldiers buried together from the York Patrol all had utensils. So they were wearing utensils, and it highlights the fact there's the 2 big questions in World War I and pretty much down through the ages. The first big question, where do we go from here? Because they're wanting to go home. And the second big question is, when do we eat? Because they're always hungry. And especially in World War I, when you're advancing ahead of the capability, the supplies and the support, that was a common shared experience.
And Dr. McCoy, the materials that the uniform is made out of, is that a wool material? And do you have any sense of how much just the equipment and the uniform and stuff weighed for the soldier?
This was about 40 to 60 pounds, depending on the ammunition they were carrying. And it's interesting, it's a good question. These cartridge belts, this one's not loaded. And as you would imagine, each one of those pouches would hold 2 clips. And they found the magazines of those stripper clips in these grave sites too. So they were carrying cartridges at the time they died. These would hold 2 rounds or 2 clips each, of 5 shots each, and there would be bandoliers they'd carry on top of them. And the stories are told from the World War I soldiers. The big issue, there's going to be more rifles, because everybody that's getting killed or wounded, there's more weapons everywhere. The ammunition gets to be in short supply. So a lot of them going up toward the front, the Americans, after they'd been experienced and fought on the front, they weren't so worried about the rifle as they were carrying more ammunition. Throw the rifle down, carry more ammunition. But that was interesting in the depiction. This right here is a first aid kit. And that's in the little pouch attached to it. And then the gas mask, and it's important, it's held backwards. You see so many images where the flap opens to the front, but when you're lying on top of the mask in the mud, and then the debris and everything else, you want the flap to open away from you to get the gas mask out and get it on. You don't want that gas mask bag full of every kind of debris on the battlefield. So it lies open to the back. And then it also depicts here is, this is a bolo. It's just like a utility knife, and then the canteen. Because the other thing, especially the World War I soldiers ran out of, was food and drink. We don't have enough water. We can't drink out of shell holes. The shell holes are all contaminated with mustard gas. And it depicts the fact mustard was a blistering agent, and it was meant to burn the skin. Everywhere the skin got wet got burned. So in the crotch area, in the armpits, the waistband, everybody got burned because of the mustard gas exposure. The hope was you keep it out of your lungs, could keep breathing and functioning. And it was a big issue, World War I, gas warfare. Over here, what we're depicting, though, is from the Americans, the cross-section, the numbers involved. What about Sergeant York? And here's Sergeant York up here in the back. And if there ever was a non-soldier, it'd be York. And he tried to tell him, I'm not a soldier. I don't want to be a soldier. I don't have the interest in going over and killing people. He had an amazing background, skilled and talented shot as a hunter, had become skilled and talented with a pistol, which became real important in that battle too, and had the feelings based on his religious beliefs. And after his conversion, and it talks about here, he was in the Church of Christ and Christian Union. So a small denominational background from a very small town American background. This man became a hero. He was 32 years old at the time. I believe that's correct. And what was amazing is he didn't fit in with those soldiers either. They were there 18, 19, 20, 21, all over America. They drink, they smoke. He won't drink or smoke. He won't have, and even the humor, the stuff they're talking about, it's not his background. So at the time they thought he doesn't really fit in. No one would have dreamed the hero he would become. This is talking about where he entered the army at Camp Gordon, and the soldiers here and worrying about their feet, because that's going to be incredibly important. Can you function? Can you continue? And there they are lined up for the foot inspection. These are the soldiers going toward the front, and all that gear and equipment, 40 to 60 pounds. The only thing that carries it is the ankle express. You got to carry it every step of the way. And this shows them laying things out. This one's got the bayonet at the ready. Those are Eddystone rifles those men are armed with. It was about 2 to 1 of the Eddystones. These are actually British rifles these men are armed with. But it depicts what we were up against, learning as they went along. It was truly on-the-job training for an awful lot of these guys. They were getting into the military, and by the middle of the summer of 1918, soldiers were being inducted into the military right off of the ships coming from Italy, Ireland. Right off the ships, the soldiers are herded in to be inducted in the American Army. And a lot of them had about 4 to 6 weeks of training and background before they were being sent to France as replacements, put in the Army, entering into units. And just like in York's group, a lot of them are learning how to load and shoot the rifle in the trenches. And that's a bad place to be learning. And that's what these fellows are showing. It's going to be catch as catch can. That's what's left of a trench after shell fire's torn it all apart. This is one of the flags that actually was used in the 82nd Division. And that actually came out of a 319th Field Artillery group that a soldier brought home. And it's been used. So this flag has been over there. And this is from before the AA insignia being adopted. It's the same red, white, and blue, but the 82 is the 82nd Division. And that came from that artillery position that was part of the 82nd Division at the time. These were some more of the stories about him being involved in the fight in Châtel-Chehery. That was the little town, and we'll see it on the map on the actual depiction. This is Sergeant York here with his wife. And actually, that's at the Hermitage in Nashville. And what it's depicting is, again, York is surprised as everybody else. This is York After the battle, this is later in 1919, a group of officers wanted to go with York to the actual battlefield site and show us how you did this, York, because it was phenomenal. And as he told them, every time a head come up, I done knocked it down. And it was an amazing depiction. We'll show it in the map here in a moment, because the skill, it was phenomenal, but the control to be able to stay in one place and hold to the task at hand was incredible. And this talks about the patrol that was involved, the other American soldiers. This right here, the train, that's what they were trying to do. The whole point of this was part of the 82nd Division to cut through at Châtel-Chaheri and cut the ammunition lines that were supplying that part of the German defensive positions in the Argonne. Part of the impetus for cutting those positions was that the lost battalion at the point of this in October 18th was still cut off in what they called the pocket. They were about a battalion of the 77th Division, the Statue of Liberty Division, New York National Troops. They were cut off by the Germans, surrounded. The Germans kept compelling them to surrender. They wouldn't surrender. So it was the famous lost battalion. In the pocket, it was just within several thousand yards from where Châtel-Chaheri was. The role of the 82nd Division was to cut through the German lines, cut off that railroad line to force the Germans to fall back from the pocket where the lost battalion was cut off.
Did York see any action or more action after this battle? Or
Some. He was under some shell fire. They weren't in as pitched a fight or a battle after this, but it's a good point. He wasn't a hero at the time. The actual, if you look at the 328th Infantry regimental histories, the original one that came out in 1919, 1920, it talks about York being a Distinguished Service Cross winner. At that point, York had not been awarded the Medal of Honor yet. So at the time, he was a sergeant. He was a corporal at the time of the fighting. He made sergeant, which was a fairly easy decision. He had such talent and ability, but they had no sergeants. So he was promoted into the position. That's why he's still called Sergeant York, but at the time of the battle was a corporal. And back to your point, just another corporal, just another American soldier, and in a sense, completely expendable. And so it was weeks after this, the war finally got closer to the end. The 82nd Division got pulled out, but as long as the 82nd Division was there, York was in with it, Company G, 328. And that's neat. We're going to see all the artifacts. These are the parts of the story and the details. On the other side, the artifacts that illustrate everything. And that was part of this whole plan. This was between 2006 and 2009, 3 expeditions by an international team of geographers, historians, and archaeologists were in the Argonne Forest to pinpoint the location where all of this took place on October 8, 1918. And it's incredible that the details as it came together tells even more of the story. This machine gun is interesting to consider because that very MG-08 machine gun was in Fentress County at the courthouse in Jamestown. That was brought back and stored and displayed there at the courthouse until the Second World War broke out. That was one of the machine guns that York had captured at this time in the forest there around Châtel-Chaheri. And what was interesting then, the archaeologists and the folks who went back and did the excavations from those machine gun positions found those spent cartridges. So as you can imagine, all these machine gun rounds are piled up, just the spent cartridges. Those are some of the original cartridges fired on that patrol. And that's one of the original guns.
and the mass of that is just extraordinary. It looks heavy. The gauge of the steel looks heavy, but what brought it down was where it took around in the water cooler.
That was the way to make it unserviceable. Yeah, the way you would render it, because like any other time, the Germans get forced back. Typically, and all through World War I, their big first attempt after that counterattack. We lose the position, not a problem. They won't be able to hold it. We're going to push them right out. And so the thinking was, we'll take our own machine guns back. And we'll have our own machine, and it happened over and over again. The Americans, until they realized what was going on, Germans in bunkers and Germans under the ground, we push over a position, and they think, hey, we're breaking through so easily, until now we're getting counterattacked from the front and from the back because there's Germans behind us with the machine guns turning them right back on us from the other side. And so the way to make sure that didn't happen, you got to take out all the machine gun crew, you got to take out the machine gun. And the way to take it out is fire around through that water jacket, because it's a water-cooled machine gun. Right there, the spigot, this is what attaches to the water cooling. That has to draw the water and in that evaporation cool that machine gun barrel that keeps it from warping. And if the gun barrel warps, it's not going to fire. So the way to do that, to keep it from being cooled, you render it unserviceable by taking out the water jacket. And that's cool. That gun was there that day. Those rounds, those cartridges were there that day. And then lo and behold, the entrenching tool had an interesting story that the archaeologists, the folks doing the map studies, when they found the exact spot, those tools were talked about at the time of this photograph. When York went back with those officers later and looking at the battlefield site, show us how you did it, show us how you did it. And so they took German entrenching tools and used them for targets, stuck the tool up. York would get down in the exact position he was in and fire and show you. And what's fascinating, that particular entrenching tool that came off the battlefield side, it also has a .45 caliber round to it. The smaller is the rifle cartridge, but the great big hole is from a .45 caliber pistol fired into it. York used both of them that day, because part of the reason for the German patrol of the 7 men to try to come and overwhelm him was that they know the rifle holds 5 cartridges. So he's put the stripper clip in and chambered the first round and started shooting. If there's more men than he can do it, they should be able to overrun it. The problem, the issue, and there's still raging debate, where did York have that .45 caliber automatic pistol? Some say that he was wearing it on his little finger and shooting the rifle at the same time. So, I mean, he was amazingly talented, and like he would say, God prepared me to play the role that day that I played.
So they made him do a live fire reenactment.
And that's the entrenching tool from that live fire. I'll show you how I did it.
Wow.
And it's cool that it's one of those rounds is a .45 automatic round that went through it. And because York was using it. And if he was carrying it on the little finger, to have it right there that he could pull it up. He shot those last 2 German soldiers at point blank range. They just didn't get there fast enough. And it was fascinating to consider that was there. Those cartridges, that tool, and that machine gun. That's an example. York brought one of those helmets back. He's got a German camouflage helmet he brought back as a souvenir. And so that's the reason. This isn't that one, but we thought we've got to have one. Because York, like so many of the American soldiers, and that's the old expression that the British fight for the glory, but the Americans fight for the souvenirs. And so even at the time of the battle, the stuff going on, they're claiming souvenirs and laying stuff back. And it's interesting, one of the photographs in one of the displays right here, in one of the depictions, and that's what we had done. This is part of our overall museum collection that we've used these photographs, and those are actual Signal Corps photographs done during the war. These are American soldiers in front of that 105 millimeter howitzer. And it's interesting, what's written on the front, the flash shield of the howitzer, peace talks. It's like, we'll show you some peace talks. We're about to fire a peace talk. And the American right in the middle has 2 German flare guns as souvenirs. So they were getting souvenirs and carrying those souvenirs even at the time of the battle. Right around here, this is what's fantastic. This was a curator, one of the folks at the Tennessee State Museum, Ron Westfall, did this depiction. And this is a topographic map, a recreation of the actual battlefield site. And what's fascinating is he's got on here pinpointed, here's the little collection of houses, and that's still there in France, and that's where the monument is to York in France, is right in Châtel-Chehery. And this is that depiction of the town. York, where they were stopped, they were advancing in this direction and against that hill right there. And the problem was as they were stopped at the very beginning of the red line, that's where Bernard Early, the sergeant, told Murray Savage to take that patrol, and those American soldiers cut in behind that German machine gun position and see if you can get them cut off. If we can take out those guns, we can advance over this hill and cut that railroad. And as it ended up, as they came up this way, got through unopposed, got in behind them, and that gully was where they ran into the Germans eating breakfast. They followed, there were two medics that when they startled them, they because they're behind German lines, the medics ran that way down the gully, right into where the Germans were eating breakfast. The Americans surprised them. The first group of Germans captured was in that gully. Then they came around, crossed the stream, and where the white thumbtack is about where they got ambushed because the Germans, the machine guns that had been firing the whole time toward the Americans in the front, realized there are Americans behind us now, and they fired down, and the command was given to the group of Americans with the German prisoners, get down, in German. And when they gave the command for them to get down, of course the Germans are hearing it in German. They get down. They know what's about to happen. So they flatten out. The Americans hesitate, trying to figure out what's going on. The machine guns open fire. That's when the first Americans got killed, was right there in that gully. That's when Murray Savage got killed. And so think about what it would take. What did it feel like to be sergeant? You don't fit in. You're older to begin with. You didn't want to be there. You're right in the middle of it now. You got to do something now. Murray Savage was in command. He was the sergeant. He watched Murray get hit. That was his best friend in the whole army. And Murray got hit. He saw him get hit over and over again. Murray was trying to crawl away and get into cover, and was able just barely to crawl off and then died. So York sees all of this happen. Somebody's got to do something. And so York decides, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. And he lies right there, and there's a little depression of the ground. And essentially, where that white thumbtack is, York lies against the ground at about a 45-degree angle. He's looking uphill where you can see the flashes, you can see the bursts coming from the machine guns. And he can realize where they are. He's got like a target layout, like a shooting gallery, and he just starts popping them. Because behind every one of those machine gun breeches, on those spade handles, there's a German helmet looking right over it, aiming and firing that gun. So he shoots right across where the burst is coming from, hits the German in the head. Next one comes up to take it over, hits him in the head. They raise up to see where the fire's coming from, hits him in the head. And it was one of the interesting comments that York made to the German officer after the surrender finally, when all the prisoners are gathered up. The German officer, he was having them get our wounded, get our wounded. He was having the Germans carrying the American wounded from the battlefield, and the German officer asked York, well, aren't we going to get my wounded? And York just looked at him and said, you don't have any wounded. Because he'd shot every one of those men in the head. It's like, your men are, any one of your men that's hit is dead. And they were. And that's what took place. And finally, with him shooting one after another, taking out, essentially stopping each machine gun, there's some talk, some debate that York was calling out the whole time, surrender, surrender. And the Germans weren't about to surrender at the time. York kept shooting, kept taking out German soldiers. And so the decision that the Germans made was, we've got to take this man out. The fire's coming primarily from right there, where the white thumbtack is. The only way we're going to stop that fire is to go down there and take that man out. So 7 of them attack, and York kills all 7, largely as depicted in the Gary Cooper movie. And what took place, he took out the last one, then the next to the last one, and it was like shooting turkeys. So to York, it was like a real-life video game. And as long as he stays right in that depression, they can't get to him before he can take them out.
Now, the machine guns were positioned where those red...
Where the red tacks are. And so when they diverted the others and started shooting, and some say, and that's been the raging debate, how many guns? How many guns? 23 machine guns? No, probably the guns, there were 6 or 7 of these MG08s up there. And then as the machine gunners and the different crew members are being taken out, that's when finally that patrol is able, the German, he compels them to call on them to surrender. The Germans do surrender. The machine guns then are unmanned, and the whole group starts advancing this way back toward American lines.
The movie depicts that he got in where the machine guns were and then was on the flank of others. Is that accurate or no?
Just in the sense that the guns were on the top of the hill facing the forward battlefield is the dotted line here. So what happened is they were in behind and beside the German position, which then was diverted down to them. So then they were all firing downhill. But it just was a perfect place for a perfect time for someone to be the hero. And that's what York's point was all along, is any other man would have done it. Of course, it took lying in that depression and having that kind of shooting skill and talent and ability and wearing the pistol and able to protect against the close-up attack as well as the far-off attack, and to stay there and keep killing as long as it took. And essentially, that's York's point, was that's what I did. I had to stop the killing, which is intriguing, killing one after another of the German soldiers. Yep, but that's where it took place. And the rest of this hillside, all of this depiction, this is made to scale. So Ron went to great lengths using all kinds of topographic maps and GPS information and background to put this map together. And that's exactly the way the ground looked, where York did the event. And that's what's incredible, is to think how much effort, 3 different trips, we're going to look at the GPS. There was tremendous amount of information to put together to know how could you find that exact spot where that took place. And that's what this next section goes into, is what was going on. And it's applying the very latest of the global positioning technology, and we'll look at the actual devices, the electronic devices used to do that. But this shows where the artifacts were found. Once they had found where we're going to look for where this York event took place, those artifacts in the deposition essentially confirmed what they had done with the research. The research information that was used, and that's this section here, reconstructing the past. The Argonne is a great big place, and it still is. The German depiction was not exactly the same as the American depiction of where the battle took place. These are field orders that were done from the time of the battle, and this is from Buxton, which was York's commanding officer up the chain, and that was his account of where it took place. All of that research was assembled, everything brought together, and what's intriguing is it raises the interesting issue. When you're trying to talk about what exactly took place where, whether it's at the Argonne near Châtel-Chehery, or if it's the Little Bighorn, somebody's got to figure out what was said, because in many cases it's different from what actually happened. And putting all the information, sifting out what was said, and localizing where they could, would, should have been, and then going with the global positioning and then the metal detectors and all the archaeological work to find exactly where the artifacts are that justify the account of where the battle took place. And this shows here again, the German narrow gauge railroad. That was the whole plan, was to cut this railroad right here. The red line. And this is where Châtel-Chehery is. That's the hill that the York battle took place against. And exactly the direction at which the attack was going, and the lost battalion was cut off down here. So to get the lost battalion out of the pocket, cut the railroad from this side. This is east. It's essentially cutting into the side instead of attacking up in the main thrust of the Meuse-Argonne. It's attacking to the west to take out the railroad to open up for the lost battalion. And that's what they did then from the positioning. And this is an incredible man right here. Tom Nolan is a professor in global positioning type technology, map making at MTSU. He's retired now. So in a sense, he was the right person to put this project together. He did all the computer and the GPS work, working with the French and the Belgian archaeologists and archivists to bring the whole project to completion. But then the device came along at just the right time. And this now doesn't hold a candle to the GPS positioning technology that's available now. But at the time, 6 years ago, 8 years ago, this was state of the art. That's what was used with the satellite technology to localize the exact position on the battle where all of these things took place. And what's interesting, the display over here that shows all of the archaeologic sites, every one of those black dots, every one of those is recorded where it was found based on the satellite technology. So nothing's been done quite like that in a modern day battlefield. On around here, these are those artifacts. And it's interesting that in the display, David Curry, who's working with, oh, let's pause just a moment. Credit where credit's due in the whole project also, besides Tom Nolan, the global positioning, what the French and the Belgians were doing, this is David Curry's company, Encore Interpretive Design. David Curry is the genius behind the display. And he's the one using the stuff and the stories to really depict something that is worth looking at. And we're thrilled to have him working with us on the museum. He's not on our board, but he's in direct collusion with us trying to save this history and put these items together. He'd been a curator at Travelers Rest for years and years, knows everybody in that whole museum clientele in Nashville, Franklin area too. These are those artifacts, and this is what's so fascinating. David Curry, the way he's labeled it and put it together, he's using York's accounts to tell everybody's story. And this is what's fascinating. This is not as well depicted in the movie or well understood or received. I think people all have made York the hero, but it took having that entire American patrol there to make that happen, and all of that with the interaction with the German soldiers. That's York's quote. He described it as a burst of fire when those machine guns opened up and started killing the American soldiers that were there in the patrol. That lists the first 4 soldiers that were killed. Those are their grave sites. The original event, the way it took place on the battlefield, it was typical for a World War I battlefield until it was pushed beyond, until the line of advance was well beyond the battlefield. Those soldiers largely laid on the battlefield where they died. So these Americans laid on that battlefield about 2 weeks, right where they fell, before anyone was able to bury them on the battlefield to begin with, and then later to move them to the American cemeteries or to move them home. And that's what's great about all of the York Patrol's experience and going right back to the battlefield. And that's why, honestly, the whole project, it's called In the Footsteps of Sergeant York, because they were all taking the same footsteps. They were all in the same risk, just like York. One of the interesting stories that's right in here is Fred Waring's. And these are some of the artifacts that actually came from those graves of all 4 soldiers. Waring was one of these 4 that was buried there. Waring's mother very much wanted to have his body brought home when he was moved from here, being buried on the battlefield, to being buried in the National Cemetery. She wanted his remains brought home. And that was several years later that the government suddenly decided, and it was as much a political move as anything, we want to bring the bodies home of any of the families that want to have their soldiers brought back. We'll do it. So Fred's mother very much wanted him to be brought back, and she wrote on the photograph of the original gravesite. Someone had given her a copy, and she submitted it with the request for having Fred's body brought home. Please, please be sure you send the right body back. She wanted to make sure from those 4 that she got her son's body back. That went on, kind of classic story, for up to 2 years. Fred's mother was in ill health and finally died. And her husband then decided, leave Fred's body in France. Leave him with his friends, leave him with the people he died with. And wrote here, Fred Waring, 2 years ago, this letter I got back, please send him home. And the father wrote back on the same letter, just her husband notified the War Department that their son's remains should stay in France. That was after Fred's mother had died. So she finally died with her illness, and Fred's still in France. These artifacts, what's cool, remember we were talking about the utensils and in the puttees, when do we eat, when do we eat? 3 out of 4 of those soldiers in those 4 graves were carrying utensils on their immediate bodies. When all the gear and equipment was taken off and those bodies were buried on the battlefield, those utensils were still there. They were going to eat somewhere, somehow, sometime, as soon as possible. These are German artifacts that came from the battle. And what's interesting, oh, and this talks about Murray Savage, we'll get into this over here, that York's best friend, shot in the abdomen, tried to crawl to safety, and just curled up and died right in front of York. These artifacts here are from the whole expedition, and what's neat is it highlights the fact of how much of an international effort was made in those 3 different trips that the guys made to France. And this shows the Europeans and all of their names. And that's been a raging debate on all of this from the time of the battle, who got the credit. And of course, we all know that in a sense, York got all the credit. But it's remarkable still to remember there were so many other soldiers that were part of that whole effort. Sergeant Early didn't get a Distinguished Service Cross until 1929. And that's him here to the right. That was one of the patrol who finally got the credit. And here's what York said about it. Although I was credited with practically wiping out the whole battalion, I was only one of the 17 who did the job. Any one of the other boys could have done the same thing I did if fate had put them in my place. If any of my buddies who were there with me that October day are listening, I want them and the whole world to know that without their cool courage, none of us would be alive today. I'll never forget them. And it's neat, as humble as he was, he knew every bit of the reality. Here to the right, during the project, all the Europeans involved, one of the groups of folks who was invited to come over there, these are descendants of other members of the patrol on the far right corner. And here's the listing. It says, a banner left near the site of the engagement by descendants of men in the patrol recognizing their service and contribution on October 8th, 1918.
And Doctor, what's kind of interesting, when you see the scope of it, all the horror that went on, and you hear the Argonne Forest and stuff, but if you look at the picture, that could have been just one of our local little hills or valleys right here in Tennessee, or up where Sergeant York grew up from Pell Mell.
And it's neat to remember, see here to the right, it's like any other woods. And suddenly it's just made into a killing ground. And that's what this shows. These are thousands of pieces of unexploded ordnance unearthed every year on the Western Front. And that's just one little part of the battlefield. So it was an amazing contrast from rural background farming folks who'd never been, to go to, they called it Jamestown. That was a big trip.
Yep.
For folks to go from Pall Mall to Jamestown, that's a big deal. That's a special event to go to the county seat. And suddenly, people from that kind of background all over America are flooded in, and it shows it in the fall down here. There's the fall colors, just like in East Tennessee, just like in Middle Tennessee. And suddenly it's ordinary folks doing extraordinary things. These artifacts, it was amazing how much they found from the actual battlefield site. That's the water reservoir, that's the water tank for the machine gun. And they found one of those there. German entrenching tools like the one we saw over there they used for a target. What's neat is to look here specifically. One of the great finds of all of the artifacts that they experienced in the archaeology and the expedition, from one of those grave sites, people say, this could have been any other artifacts from any other battlefield. How do you know this is where Sergeant York was? That's one of the collar discs that came from one of the grave sites from right up here against the uniform, and it's 328 Company G. So the collar disc off of one of those soldiers is to the company that York was in. And if that wasn't enough, in terms of the history, one of the knives that came out of the graves is actually engraved down the side of the knife, 328G. So these are items from Company G, 328th Infantry, from that battlefield and that day's fighting. So it's pretty remarkable to have that kind of information pinned down. The photographs too, this is a neat story. Murray Savage's grave. Murray Savage was buried separate. That was the sergeant. That was the one in immediate command of the patrol that York took over when Murray got killed. That was York's best friend. And what's neat, they've gone back and using the research and the GPS, they have depicted and found out all these black dots are the actual artifacts from exactly where they were found with the global positioning. They found the German machine gun fields of fire, so they finally found the exact place on the battlefield Murray Savage got killed. And that's where he was buried, right where he was killed. And what's interesting is, if looking up here close, that's one of Murray Savage's dog tags on the cross marking the grave where they buried him at the time. This is about 19 February, March, so it's still wintertime, snow on the ground. There's an Eddystone rifle. That was just what is depicted in there with the mannequin, but that's what York used that day. It still has the bayonet fixed on it. This is a cartridge belt, and if you look close, it's actually cut in two. So that machine gun fire against Murray Savage, when all of those rounds were hitting him, it cut the belt in two off the body. That's one half of that cartridge belt. What's cool is when they found his grave and the site on the battlefield where it took place, and with the metal detectors then did the archaeology and finding the stuff, these are all the metal portions of that cartridge belt from that grave site. That's the helmet that was in the site, that's the American watch that Murray Savage was carrying, and the hilt of that bayonet was still there. So someone had gotten the rifle, but everything else was still on and around Murray Savage's grave when they located it. So it's just neat to realize the detail of the whole research project and how remarkable it was to find this kind of information. And I love this last piece. It was God's will, and that was York's claim through the whole thing. It was God's will. He prepared me to be an instrument in his hand, and he saw it much more as like Gideon from the Old Testament, that he was God's chosen servant at this specific time. God had him there to do this project. And that was interesting then, of looking at the entire roster, looking at where the different soldiers were buried on the battlefield. York never felt like he was anything but one part of the bigger team, that whole patrol that accomplished those events that day. And it's interesting, these are even from Wine's burial site, the pieces off of his shoe that were left in the grave. Cartridges he was carrying, his shaving stick, and it's amazing to think those hands touched and held and used all of these items until that day. So it's remarkable. The stuff is important, but the stories we really do feel like are just as important, and it's not talking about just what happened, but how did they feel. And it's great then, this depiction of the descendants. Everybody wants to feel like my grandfather, my great-grandfather, my uncle, my cousin, he played a part. And the truth, of course, is he did play a part. He was a part of the entire process. And from the pre-revolutionary time in American history all the way to Iraq and Afghanistan, our guys and girls are still playing their part in the entire process. And that's what we're hoping to depict and save and preserve as a museum effort, is their stuff and their stories for people from now on to realize they were ordinary folks too. And it would have been perfect, that photograph of York wearing all of the medals and this from that day, if they could just show the red hair, but if they could just show the feelings of what it was he went through. That's the hope, is we'll be able to get people interested in putting all of this information together and saving it for posterity. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. McCoy. We really appreciate you coming down, and your group, your organization, and folks that want to take history that otherwise would be on a flat piece of paper and add it to a three-dimensional like this. We invite everybody to come down. The display and the exhibit will be here at South Jackson until August 3rd, 2014, October 3rd, 2014. We're open Thursday, Friday, and Saturdays from 10 till 5, and on Sunday afternoon from 12 to 4. There's no cost of admission, so come down and enjoy some history. And again, we really appreciate you coming out with us
We're
today.
thrilled to be a part of it. Thank you very much.
Very good.
I'm gonna come in on you, and
To underscore the old adage that history always happens locally, we are fortunate today that one of the hostesses at the exhibit is Miss Karen Pope from Tullahoma, currently from Tullahoma, Tennessee, and she has the unique experience as a very young child of having been to Alvin York's funeral. When you look at the carnage and the death that we talked about earlier, to find out that he lived out a full life and had just a really pretty funeral service. So Karen, if we could impose on you to share a few of your memories of that day.
Okay, actually, my father grew up in that area, so he was real interested in, watched the movie that night when he passed away, and loaded our family up with 4 children in the car, and we went up to the funeral that day. I really didn't know much about him, but you could tell there was importance when we pulled up. And the farmhouse, it doesn't look like what is on TV now. It was kind of old and things like that, but it was unusual. We went in and walked around the circle. We was greeted by the family, and that's the first dead person I'd seen. And he was, we all know, a very important person. And then we got to go to the funeral. It was by invitation only, but Governor Frank Clement was there. We went in, circled behind the church there, and got to hear part of that funeral and service. And then we left, and my father took us back by the York Institute, because he was important for education also, and how Alvin York wanted to be known as the humanitarian. But it was very impressive. It was still like a joyful occasion that day, but knowing that he had fought his final battle and was laid to rest that day. And it has stuck with me, you know, all my life, knowing the importance of such a great historian in the state of Tennessee.
Well, thank you. And you are compiling your thoughts and memories into a short story, is that right?
That's correct. From Tullahoma News, someone was going to interview me, and I thought, well, you know, the facts are kind of short for the funeral only, but different points of view that my family members had, and I'm kind of proud of it. It's going to be about 2 pages, but we'll see if it's going to be published. If not, then I'll just hand it out up here as people come through.
Well, thank you. And it was interesting. We talked a little bit more at length about it, and just the heat of the weather and the beauty of the church and the simplicity of the service. So, again, we appreciate it. Thank you very much, Karen. And Karen will be with us on the weekends.
Saturday and Sundays.
Saturdays and Sundays. So if you get a chance to sit down and visit with her, she can even make this experience more personal and interesting for you.